Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away. The systems behind the games. The contracts hidden inside victory. The lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. You notice it first in the smell, not the blood. The roses. Snow's signature white rose isn't just a fashion choice. It's engineered perfection. Petals bred to be flawless, scent amplified until it chokes the air. At face value, it looks pure, controlled, almost gentle. But canon tells you the real purpose. That flower is working overtime to cover the stench of mouth sores and blood from years of poison. So, here's the real question. What kind of man turns his own decaying body into a perfume problem to solve? And what if Panem's most terrifying dictator started out as the most frightened person in the room and never stopped being that scared kid? We're used to seeing President Snow as this calm, unshakable presence. He's the one sipping champagne while children die in the arena, the one who can order a district firebombed without raising his voice. But there is a lot to uncover here, because his entire power base is built on never taking a fair risk. He doesn't win duels, he doesn't charge into battles, he hides behind poison, behind roses, behind other people's terror. You think back to the 10th Hunger Games, when Coriolanus Snow is just a starving student in a ruined capital apartment. On paper, he has status. In reality, he's counting grains of rice, terrified that if anyone sees how poor he is, his family's name disappears. So why the change from desperate teenager to icy president? And why does every step of that journey avoid direct confrontation? Any mentor in those early games could tell you the arena was supposed to be about punishment. But Snow sees something else. He sees a system he can survive in without ever stepping into the blood himself. That part matters, because his first real victories are academic sabotage, rigged bets, emotional manipulation of Lucy Gray. He learns that if you control the story, you never have to fight fair. So the real question isn't just how did Snow get so cruel, it's how did his terror of death, hunger, and irrelevance evolve into an entire political system? Why does a boy who once starved in the capital end up designing a Panem where every district lives one bad harvest away from rebellion? And that's the point? Why turn the games into a religion of fear instead of just a punishment on a schedule? Every rose on his lapel, every televised arena, every carefully staged interview with a trembling victor is a shield. It's a way to keep danger at arm's length while still pulling every string. Snow poisons rivals instead of debating them. He weaponizes beauty, tigress, the pageants, the parades, to distract from the rot underneath. So in this video, we're going to cover how a boy too afraid to be powerless becomes a man who builds an entire nation around his fear. From starving student to poison-soaked president, we'll track how every arena, every rule change, every whispered threat is one more rose pinned over the smell of his own panic. And by the end, you have to ask yourself, is Panem ruled by a monster or by a terrified survivor who made his fear everyone else's prison? So let's put those two versions of Snow in the same frame for a second. You have the teenage Coriolanus, secretly counting grains of rice in a freezing capital apartment, pretending the plinth prize money is definitely coming. His shirt is pressed, his manners are perfect, and his stomach is empty. The capital still looks grand from the outside, but for him, the promise is already broken. President Snow at the head of a banquet table, crystal glasses, whole pigs, sugared fruits. He raises a toast while on screens behind him, children murder each other for the cameras. Feasts in the capital, starvation in every district, public executions, televised games, and that ever-present white rose covering the rot in his mouth. At face value, those are two different people. But here's the real question. What happens when a boy who is terrified of slipping down the social ladder discovers that fear is the most reliable currency in Panem? Why does someone who once hid his poverty under perfect uniforms decide that everyone else's suffering should be impossible to hide? This is where we talk about the blueprint. Snow's story isn't just a tragic backstory, it's a user manual for turning scarcity into a permanent power structure. Back then, he's gaming the 10th Hunger Games to win food and status, sending Lucy Gray gifts, manipulating odds, avoiding any risk that might expose his own weakness. Now, he's the architect of a system where every district lives one bad harvest away from punishment, and every victor is paraded as proof that obedience might, maybe, be rewarded. So why does a coward choose poison over open conflict? The reason is brutally simple. Poison lets him kill without looking dangerous. It keeps his hands clean in public, while his body literally rots in private. That part matters because it's the exact relationship he builds between the capital and the districts, smiling host on the surface, invisible agony underneath. You never see the knife, you only see the consequences. And in that world, what does victory even mean? Snow survives the 10th Games era by scheming his way out of poverty. Katniss survives the 74th by outsmarting the arena. But in Panem, surviving once never means the games are over. Survival just buys you a new round with worse rules. Snow wins food, now he has to defend status. Katniss wins freedom, now she has to mentor, perform, and watch her victory turned into propaganda. There is a lot to uncover here, because if we can track how Snow weaponized his own fear of hunger, irrelevance, and exposure, we can see why the rebellion had to look the way it did. Why does he fixate on Katniss in particular? Why is a traumatized girl with a mockingjay pin both his worst nightmare and, in a twisted way, his final validation? We're going to cover how the boy who once begged the system to recognize him ends up needing Katniss to challenge him on the biggest stage in Panem, and why for Snow, even losing might count as a kind of victory. Our lens on Snow, cowardice as a political strategy. So here's the move we're going to make in this video. We're not treating Snow as a cartoon villain. We're treating him as a terrified kid who figured out how to turn his own panic into policy. Because Snow's rise to power is not the story of a brave revolutionary. It's the story of a coward who learned to industrialize fear, starting with his own, and then built a nation so he'd never have to feel powerless again. At face value, Panem looks like a dictatorship built on punishment. But here's the real question. What if it's actually a security blanket for one man's anxiety? This is where we talk about our lens. Every major choice Snow makes, we're going to read as a defensive move. Lucy Gray, she isn't just a love interest, she's a test case in control, a girl he can't fully predict, which terrifies him. The 10th Hunger Games innovations, sponsorships, betting, turning tributes into characters, those aren't creative flourishes from a bold strategist. They're ways to put distance between himself and the arena, to make other people's suffering into a system he can manage from the stands. Why poison instead of open confrontation? Why roses instead of honesty about the sores in his mouth? Because Snow refuses to enter a fair fight. Poison lets him win without risk. The roses let him hide the physical cost of that choice. That part matters because it shows you the pattern. Every time Snow feels vulnerable, he doesn't get braver. He gets more elaborate. More rules, more rituals, more spectacle. Panem sees Snow as a ruthless monster who enjoys the games. Snow sees himself as a survivor in a world that tried to eat him first, a boy who was secretly starving in the capital, watching his family status rot. Both versions are true, and the truth sits in the tension between them. Why does he cling so hard to the role of president, to the image of perfect control? Because irrelevance is his real nightmare. A dead dictator is one thing, a forgotten one, that's worse. So the big themes we're going to cover all orbit that fear. Order versus chaos. Snow turns the games into a yearly ritual to prove the world is predictable, that every district knows its place. Purity versus contamination. From the roses masking the smell of blood to his disgust at tainted victors, he's always trying to scrub away reminders that power makes him dirty. Spectacle versus reality. He builds a show so convincing that even he can pretend he's in control, while the real horror is how fragile it all is, and we'll track this across the whole saga. From Ballad of Songbirds and Snake's flashbacks to his smooth threats to Seneca Crane, to that icy conversation with Coin on the value of one last symbolic games, there is a lot to uncover here. It's one continuous fear-driven pattern. In the next section, we'll drop into those early years and watch that pattern form in real time, starting in a ruined capital apartment with a hungry boy who already dreams of never being at the mercy of anyone ever again. What we're unpacking today, and the twist waiting at the end. So what are we actually going to track in Snow's rise from hungry teenager to the capital's favorite monster? Because if you just jump from starving student to poisoned president, you miss how methodical this transformation really is. First, we're going to cover Phase 1, the ruined apartment, the academy, and the 10th Hunger Games. This is where we talk about Snow as a boy who is already terrified of entering the arena, already calculating how to stay adjacent to danger without ever stepping into it. We'll unpack how mentoring Lucy Gray, rigging bets, and manipulating broadcasts teach him the first big lesson. If you can control the story of the games, you never have to be the one holding the knife. That part matters because it's the blueprint he keeps using for the rest of his life. Then we move into Phase 2, turning the games from a crude punishment into a religion of fear. Back then, the games are barely held together, no real spectacle, no stable audience, no promise that people will keep watching. So why the change? Why add pageantry, interviews, and that whole career tribute culture? We'll look at how Snow pushes volunteering, sponsorships, and psychological warfare to keep both the capital and every district emotionally invested. At face value, it's entertainment. Underneath, it's a system that makes hope and terror feel like the same thing. Phase 3 zooms in closer, poison roses, and the politics of appearances. Here's the real question. Why does a man who's supposedly untouchable spend so much effort smelling good? We'll trace his relationship with Tigris, the fading Snow family name, and the capital's obsession with surface beauty. We'll talk about how his own use of poison literally rots his mouth, forcing him to hide the stench with roses, and how that becomes a whole aesthetic of purity. Clean white suits, perfect bloodless hands, a controlled scent. Every detail is a weapon saying, nothing touches me, and nothing of me touches you. Phase 4 is Snow versus symbols. Lucy Gray, Katniss, and Coin. Why do singers, mockingjays, and rival presidents scare him more than any single victor or district? We'll map how his fear of uncontrollable icons shapes his endgame, from trying to script Katniss's love story to threatening Seneca Crane, to that final conversation with Coin about one last symbolic games. For Snow, the real enemy is any story he can't edit. And then, at the end, we're going to break the pattern. We'll close with a speculative segment. What if Snow had made one different choice in the 10th arena? No snakes, no rigged show, no betrayal. Would Panem actually be better? Or would a braver Snow have built something even worse? Hold that question, because everything we cover next is the evidence. Welcome to the arena of analysis. So if we're treating Snow's 10th games as evidence, here's the real question. What kind of channel turns a teenager's panic in a gladiator pit into a full political profile of Panem's future dictator? This one. This is a space for obsessive Hunger Games breakdowns. We're going to cover the quiet, uncomfortable stuff the movies rush past. The relationship between a trembling Coriolanus hiding in the arena stands and the polished president who later turns those same games into a religion of fear. Character studies, world building, the political mechanics under every anthem cue and every camera pan back to a sobbing district family. That's the territory. If you just wandered in from a dramatic edit of Snow twirling a rose, fair warning, we go deep. This video is going to assume you're at least somewhat familiar with the original trilogy and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. We're going to mention Tigris, the 10th games, the roses, the poison, the lies, without pausing every time to recap who's who. Think of it less as a recap, more as a forensic analysis of the story you already know. At face value, the style here is pretty simple. Conversational, a little dramatic, but always pinned to the text. When we talk about Snow's mouth sores and his need for those overpowered roses, that's straight from canon. When we connect his starving childhood in the capital to his obsession with order and legacy, we'll flag where the text ends and interpretation begins. There is a lot to uncover here, and the rule is no pure headcanon without a label. So why treat Snow's roses like crime scene evidence? Because that part matters, because it shows the system he built. The smell is covering poison damage. The poison damage comes from using fear as a weapon. The weapon becomes the games as we see them by the time Katniss steps on stage. That's the chain. We're constantly cross-referencing the books and films to track how that evolution is framed, what the capital believes, and what Panem actually experiences. If analytical storytelling is your thing, where we freeze-frame Snow's smile and ask why it twitches right after Seneca Crane mentions hope, this is where we talk about it. We've already broken down Victor's village as a psychological cage. We've mapped out why the third quarter quell shattered the promise of safety for every victor, and we're building a whole series of Panem power profiles from there. So if you want more of that, more games as evidence, more district politics and capital propaganda pulled apart piece by piece, you can hit subscribe and stay in the arena with us. Because from here on, we're entering Snow's first real arena. Not with a sword, with a smile, a scholarship, and a stack of strategies. And the next segment, that's where we watch him test those strategies on live tributes and realize the most frightened person in the room is about to design the rules for everyone else. Before the roses, Snow's childhood in a dying capital. Snow's first arena isn't the 10th Hunger Games. It's his kitchen table. We're in the years right after the dark days, before the games have sponsors or shiny arenas, when the capital is still half bombed and half delusional. You walk through those streets, and it's rubble, ration lines, and propaganda posters promising that the victor in this new peace is the capital itself. But here's the real question. What does that victory feel like when you're Coriolanus Snow and you're starving in the so-called winning city? Back then, the Snow name still means something on paper. Old money, old prestige. The kind of family that used to host generals and game makers before the war burned their fortune down. But the money is gone, the apartments are cold, and the pantry is almost empty. Coriolanus is growing so fast his uniforms don't fit. And not because he's well fed. He's literally sewing them tighter to hide how thin he is. This is where we talk about performance. At school, he's the perfect capital student. Polished, witty, top of his class, pretending the hunger pangs are just nerves. He jokes about district grain rations in public and then goes home to measure out rice kernels in private. That double life trains him for the games long before he ever mentors a tribute. He learns you can be dying on the inside and still sell confidence on the outside, and standing between him and complete collapse, Tigress. Older cousin de facto parent, exhausted tailor. While the capital rebuilds its marble, she's rebuilding Snow's image one stitch at a time. She alters his uniforms to look expensive, reworks their grandfather's old suits so Coriolanus can still pass as elite. At face value, it's fashion. In practice, it's survival. There is a lot to uncover here in that relationship. Tigress believes clothes can protect him. Snow absorbs the lesson that appearances don't just protect power, they create it. So why does that part matter? Because of what comes later. Constant scarcity rewires him. When every meal is a question mark, when eviction is one missed payment away, humiliation becomes as terrifying as death. He's not just afraid of hunger, he's afraid of being seen as someone who could be hungry. That's a different kind of fear. It's the reason he will cling to status with the same desperation a district child clings to bread. We're going to cover his political moves soon, but you can already see the blueprint. The roses, the immaculate white suits, the calm, omniscient president persona. Those aren't luxuries. Their armor grown out of this exact apartment, this exact emptiness. The future man who poisons rivals and masks the stench with roses starts as a boy masking an empty stomach with a perfect smile. So when he finally steps into the 10th games as a mentor, the question isn't, why is he so cruel? It's what happens when a starving actor finally gets control of the script. That's where we watch him rewrite the rules of the games, not to make them bloodier at first, but to make sure no one ever sees him as weak again. The 10th Hunger Games, where Snow learns the real rules. So when Snow walks into the 10th Hunger Games, he isn't walking into the polished nightmare you remember. He's walking into a failed experiment. Back then, the arena is a bombed-out sports stadium. No force fields, no hovercraft theatrics, barely any functioning lights. The tributes aren't whisked away on high-speed trains and pampered in luxury. They're shoved into cages in the capital's zoo, displayed next to the animals, so citizens can gawk on their lunch break. At face value, it's punishment, crude, public, and frankly inefficient. The capital wants pain, but it hasn't learned how to package it yet. And this is where we talk about Snow's role. He's not a tribute, he's a mentor in a school blazer, technically safe behind the glass. But his survival is still on the line. His scholarship, his status, his access to food after years of pretending he isn't starving, all of that is tied to whether his tribute, Lucy Gray Baird from District 12, can make it through the games. So he's not fighting for his life in the arena, he's fighting for his place in the capital food chain. Here's the real question. What does a coward do when the rules finally give him power without demanding courage? Snow avoids every physical risk he can. He flinches from real violence. He panics when bombs hit the arena. He never volunteers to step into the line of fire. But the second the danger turns abstract, grades, influence, perception, he becomes fearless. He sabotages classmates, steals ideas, manipulates faculty, and bends every mentoring rule to give Lucy Gray even the smallest edge. He doesn't swing a sword. He rewrites the rubric. There is a lot to uncover here, because this is where he discovers the real engine of the games. The 10th Hunger Games are failing. People are bored. Attendance is low. The capital is starting to ask why they're still doing this. Snow's big insight is brutally simple. Killing isn't enough. You have to make people watch, care, and bet. He pushes for interviews, backstories, sponsorships. He turns Lucy Gray into a performer, not just a tribute, weaponizing her songs and charisma, so the audience forms a relationship with her fate. That part matters because it flips the power dynamic. Once you realize the games are a story first and a slaughter second, the person who controls the story is more dangerous than any victor with a sword. Snow sees that if you design the arena, script the narrative, and manage the odds, you never have to risk your own body. You can sit in the stands and still decide who lives and who dies. So when you see President Snow decades later, roses on his lapel and poison in his glass, this is the blueprint you're really looking at. The scared boy in the zoo arena learned the safest place to be isn't in the games, it's above them. And in the next section, we're going to cover how he takes that lesson out of the stadium and turns the entire country of Panem into his permanent arena. No, in the arena, cowardice, calculation, and survival. So when Snow walks out of that zoo arena and into the real world, he doesn't leave the games behind. He just scales them up. You see it in the bombing. 1 second he's a student observer, the next the arena explodes, and suddenly he's prey. Debris, smoke, screaming. He's close enough to die. What does he do? He doesn't sprint toward the rubble to pull tributes out. He ducks, hides under the stands, watches. At face value, that's ordinary survival instinct. But here's the real question. Why does the future president of Panem choose to be a spectator, even when his own life is on the line? This is where we talk about pattern. In the chaos, Sejanus runs in, desperate to save his tribute. Peacekeepers flood the arena. Other mentors panic, shout, expose themselves. Snow calculates. He uses the cover of confusion to secure his own safety first, then to position himself as useful to the people actually taking the risks. There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters because it's his first rehearsal for ruling. Let other people bleed, then step in to manage the story. You see the same thing with Lucy Gray. Physically, he edges closer to danger only when he can frame it as devotion. Emotionally, he never steps out from behind the shield. He can't fully trust her, can't accept that her survival might mean she has secrets or agency or a narrative that doesn't orbit him. So every time she sings to the crowd, every time the district starts to love her on her own terms, he feels that as a threat, not to her safety, to his control. Why does that jealousy matter? Because instead of being vulnerable, admitting he's scared of losing her or of losing the promise of being her savior, he turns to surveillance and tests. He quizzes her stories, tracks her movements, interprets every ambiguity as betrayal. Emotional cowardice becomes political training. If he can't dominate one girl's story, how will he ever dominate a country's? So when danger spikes, he defaults to indirect action, poisoning the mentor who stands in his way, manipulating Sejanus into disastrous heroism while keeping his own hands technically clean, aligning with Dr. Gall and the peacekeepers because authority is a better shield than courage. Every crisis is a choice. Step forward openly or pull a string from the shadows. You already know which option he picks. And here's the real question you're left with. If this is how he behaves with a handful of classmates and tributes, what happens when you give this exact personality type an entire country to protect and punish? When the arena is all of Panem, and every district is just another terrified Lucy Gray? In the next section, we're going to cover how those tiny, cowardly survival tactics harden into national policy. And why, for Snow, ruling Panem will always feel like hiding under the bleachers during a bombing. Lucy Gray versus Katniss, Snow's fear of unscripted girls with guitars and bows, so when those cowardly survival tactics scale up from one scared teenager to an entire country, they need something else to hold them together. A story. This is where we talk about Lucy Gray. Because before Katniss ever knocks an arrow, Snow has already met a girl who can turn punishment into performance and fear into a sing-along. At face value, Lucy Gray is just a District 12 tribute with a colourful dress and a guitar. But in the 10th games, she becomes something much more dangerous. A walking, singing glitch in the Capitol's script. Watch what she does on Reaping Day. She turns a public shaming into a concert, takes the mayor's daughter's cruelty and flips it into applause. Then in the arena, she uses songs to build a relationship with the audience, to make them care whether a district girl lives or dies. Here's the real question. In a system built on distance and dehumanization, what happens when one tribute makes you feel responsible? He literally coaches her performances, picks outfits, nudges song choices, sells a tragic love story to the Capitol. He's drawn to her power because it wins him prizes and praise. But that part matters because he's also terrified of the one thing he can't do: predict her. Lucy Gray improvises. She flirts, jokes, sings at the wrong time, refuses to stay in the neat little box of victim or victor. So what does he do? He doesn't shut her down. He tries to manage her, contain the risk, keep the reward. We're going to cover Poison and Roses later, but this is the emotional prototype. Co-opt the threat, wrap it in his narrative, and hope it forgets it ever had teeth. Jump forward decades, and suddenly there's another girl from District 12 holding a weapon and an audience. Katniss isn't a performer on purpose, but the Capitol turns her into one anyway. The girl on fire, the star-crossed lover, the unexpected victor. And just when Snow thinks he understands her script, she pulls the berries. That's Lucy Gray all over again, except now the whole country is watching. Notice the pattern. With both Lucy Gray and Katniss, Snow's first response isn't open war. It's recruitment. Sponsors, stylists, Victor's village, controlled interviews. He keeps trying to fold them into the games as proof that the system works, that the Capitol still writes the ending. Why kill a symbol outright when you can domesticate it? Here's the problem. Lucy Gray disappears into the woods, and Snow never really knows if she died or slipped his leash. That unsolved question haunts him. So when Katniss starts singing to Rue, saluting District 11, threatening double suicide, he's not just fighting a girl with a bow, he's fighting the memory of a girl with a guitar who refused to stay on script. And that cowardice around losing narrative control, that's the crack in his armor that Panem will eventually pour a revolution through. Because the next step in his rise is simple and horrifying. If you can't control the symbol, you redesign the entire system so no one like that can ever exist again. Or so you think. From student schemer to system designer. So how do you stop another Lucy Gray from slipping through your fingers? You don't just chase the girl. You redesign the maze. Back in the Capitol, Snow goes from scandal-stained academy student to something more dangerous. A student who understands the rules are softer than they look. He's seen the 10th games from the inside. He's cheated, sabotaged, emotionally blackmailed his way through them. The Capitol should expel him. Instead, it quietly absorbs him, because at face value his methods look messy. But to a system built on control, they look useful. Here's the real question. What do you do with a boy who survives by turning every relationship into leverage? You put him near the levers. Snow's academic record, his essay work on the games, his proximity to Dr. Gaul, all of that nudges him toward the machinery that will become the modern arena. He's not the architect of the Hunger Games. He's the intern who starts rearranging the blueprints when no one's watching. There is a lot to uncover here. His school tricks become state policy. Remember the way he sabotages rivals at the academy, poisoning trust before he ever poisons a person? That becomes his political signature. Remove threats quietly, make the evidence ambiguous, keep everyone guessing who's safe. That part matters because the same logic shows up later in his poison politics, in the disappearances, in the way victors never know if they're honored guests or future targets. This is where we talk about predictability. Snow hates that Lucy Gray's story ends in a question mark, so his career becomes one long attempt to erase question marks from Panem. He leans into statistics, patterns, the comfort of odds. Tributes become data. Districts become predictable sources of spectacle. If a victor inspires too much hope, the rules evolve. A quarter quell twist here, a rigged arena there, a reminder that the house always wins. And he refines the games themselves. Early on, the arenas are blunt punishment, barely controlled chaos. Snow's genius, if you want to call it that, is realizing chaos is wasteful. Why just terrify the districts when you can also addict them to the show? We're going to cover how that turns the games into a ritual, a yearly promise that the capital will give you a story, a villain, a martyr, maybe even a victor to worship. Notice the pattern. As his influence grows, everything becomes more staged. His roses hide the stench of poisoned sores. His smile hides the terror of a man who once starved in a ruined penthouse. His nation hides its brutality in pageantry and interviews. The relationship between fear and hope stops being accidental. It's engineered. And Snow eventually realizes soldiers and peacekeepers aren't enough. Guns can hold territory, but stories hold people. So his next move is inevitable. Turn the Hunger Games into a story engine the whole country can't look away from, and make sure he's the one writing the script. But what happens when a story refuses to follow its author? Snow's Games 2.0. So when a story refuses to follow its author, what does someone like Snow do? He rewrites the stage. Back in the 10th Hunger Games, the arena isn't a gleaming dome, it's a gutted sports stadium with rubble, cages, and maybe 3 working cameras on a good day. The capital forces the districts to watch, but the viewership is spotty, the sound cuts out, and half the audience is bored more than horrified. At face value, it's punishment, crude, cheap, and frankly inefficient. But here's the real question. If fear is your main resource, why waste it on a show no one wants to tune into? Snow is sitting in that problem. He's starving, humiliated, and technically just a student mentor. Yet he's the one who starts asking, what if the tributes weren't just bodies? What if they were characters? That part matters because once you care who wins, you can't look away when they lose. So he pushes interviews. He leans into stylists. He helps build narratives around Lucy Gray, around Sejanus, around every district kid who can be turned into a story instead of a statistic. We're going to cover how genius that is for someone whose number one fear is chaos. A random massacre is frightening? Sure. But a scheduled, televised, emotionally sticky massacre, that's order. That's a ritual. You know when it starts, when it ends, and who's in charge of the rules. Snow also sees the betting markets forming around the games, and instead of being horrified, he recognizes the opportunity. Once people are wagering on outcomes, they're invested in the system staying predictable enough to gamble on. So why does this shift serve him so perfectly? Because a predictable annual ritual is safer than unpredictable uprisings. If every district spends months obsessing over training scores, odds, and favorite tributes, they're not counting the number of peacekeepers or noticing the capital's weak supply lines. The games become a calendar, a drumbeat. Life in Panem is organized around reaping, parades, interviews, bloodbath, victor. This is where we talk about the games as a kind of religion. You have yearly sacrifices offered from each district. You have shared myths, clever underdogs, brutal careers, tragic star-crossed lovers. You have saints, the victors enshrined in their homes and paraded on tour, and martyrs, the dead tributes whose stories get repackaged into cautionary tales. And presiding over all of it, a capital that positions itself as priest and god at the same time. Snow understands that relationship instinctively. He's terrified of dying meaninglessly in someone else's chaos, so he builds a system where every death is framed as meaningful service to the peace of Panem. By the time he's lecturing Seneca Crane, you can hear the old fear underneath the calm. The games must be controlled, balanced. Never pure chaos, a few twists keep hope alive, but total unpredictability, that's rebellion fuel. So what happens when a tribute shows up who treats his carefully scripted religion as something she can break? Why poison, not swords? Snow's cowardly weapon of choice. So what happens when a tribute shows up who treats his carefully scripted religion as something she can break? Snow doesn't pick up a sword. He reaches for a glass. Because once you start tracking Snow's kills, a pattern jumps out at you. Rivals don't fall in duels or public purges. They get sick. They drink the wrong toast. They share a cup with the president and never really recover. And here's the really chilling part. He often drinks from the same glass. At face value, that looks generous, even intimate. But it's really an alibi you can't argue with. If Snow drank it too, how could he be the one who poisoned you? We're going to cover why that specific choice matters. Why poison, not swords or firing squads or open executions at the city circle. The capital already has peacekeepers for visible violence. Snow keeps his own hands clean by making death look coincidental, medical, inevitable. There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters more than any single murder. It tells you what he's afraid of. Think back to the boy we met in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, secretly starving, terrified of losing his status, clinging to control wherever he can find it. He survives the early games not by charging into danger, but by sending other people in, by manipulating rules, by turning chaos into a scoring opportunity. So of course his adult weapon of choice is indirect. Poison lets him win without a scene, without a fight, without ever standing in the same kind of open vulnerability he once saw in the arena and vowed never to experience again. But here's the real question. What does it cost him to live that way? The books are very clear. The poison doesn't just vanish into his enemies. It chews through him too. Mouth sores, constant pain, a body that is literally rotting from the inside out. Those iconic white roses on his lapel, not just a fashion statement. They're a mask, drenched in perfume to cover the smell of his own decaying flesh. Every time he pins one on, he's covering up evidence of the very method that built his power. This is where we talk about symbolism, because poison isn't just Snow's personal hobby, it's his operating system. Slow, invisible, baked into policy. The games themselves become a kind of institutional poison, not a single massacre, but an annual dose of fear that seeps into every district, every family, every potential victor. You don't always see the cause and effect. You just feel weaker, more hopeless, more convinced that this is how the world has to be. So what does it mean when your leader's primary weapon kills quietly, over time instead of in a single dramatic blow? It means he wants you living with chronic fear, not acute terror. Acute terror sparks revolt. Chronic fear becomes the air you breathe. And once fear is the air, what happens to someone who refuses to inhale it? The roses and the rot, weaponizing beauty and smell. For Snow, that air is perfume. This is where we talk about the roses. At face value, they're just a fashion choice. White blooms, perfect petals, expensive hybrid varieties bred in capital greenhouses. But here's the real question. How do you get from my cousin does makeup to my entire regime smells like curated innocence? The answer runs straight through Tigris and the capital's obsession with surfaces. Back when Snow is still half starving and pretending he isn't, Tigris is already working as a stylist. She's sewing, sculpting, literally remaking people for the cameras. You watch her fit Coriolanus for the 10th games, and you see it. She understands that in the capital, appearance isn't decoration, it's currency. If you can look rich, you can borrow more. If you can look confident, you can pass as powerful. That part matters because Snow is learning this in real time. He sees Tigris take a scared, broke boy and turn him into young mentor from an old family. The truth is hunger. The image is heritage. There is a lot to uncover here, but the core relationship is simple. Tigris proves that if you control what people see, you can rewrite what they think is real. Snow never forgets that lesson. He just scales it up from outfits to an entire dictatorship. Fast forward to President Snow, and the roses are doing double duty. Practically, they're covering rot. The constant poison use has left him with sores in his mouth, the smell of blood on his breath. So he drowns himself in genetically engineered fragrance. It's a walking air freshener for murder. But symbolically, that same bloom says purity, control, cultivated perfection. No thorns visible, no dirt under the nails, just a man who appears untouched by the games he orders. In a capital that worships aesthetics, this is genius and horrifying. Everyone is already trained to read surfaces as truth. Flawless skin means good health. Elaborate costumes means status. A victor's crown means the games were fair. Snow realizes that if he can own the most iconic surface in the room, his own image, he can own the narrative. He becomes the nation's brand, white, composed, fragrant, eternal. And the districts feel that brand as terror. When Katniss finds a white rose in the ruins of District 12, it's not a gift, it's a message. He doesn't need to be there. The flower is. You can burn his arenas, you can flee to 13, and he can still reach into your life with a single perfect petal. Every rose she sees after that is a reminder his power travels farther than his body. So the rose ends up being Snow's thesis statement. Everything about him is curated, scented, staged to hide cowardice and corruption underneath. His regime works the same way. The games promises honor, the victor's village promises safety, the capital promises hope through spectacle. Underneath is poison, sores, and fear. So what happens when someone finally rips up the roses and forces Panem to smell what's been underneath the whole time? Order, purity, legacy. What Snow is really afraid of. When you rip up the roses, you don't just get the smell of rot. You get the blueprint of what Snow is really afraid of. At face value, Snow talks about order the way the capital talks about fashion trends, as if it's just taste. But his version of order is brutal architecture. There are victors and there are losers. Capital and district, pure and impure, everything in its box, everything in its place. The games are the perfect example. 2 names, 1 arena, 1 survivor, and absolutely no confusion about who matters. Here's the real question. Why does he need it that rigid? Why does every line have to be so sharp you cut yourself on it? Because for Snow, order isn't about efficiency, it's about survival. Back when he was secretly starving in a ruined capital apartment, the world felt random, unstable, humiliating. 1 bad harvest, 1 missed payment, and his entire bloodline almost vanished. That part matters because he learns very early that chaos doesn't just mean discomfort, it means personal extinction. So we're going to cover his obsession with purity, because this is where we talk about the deeper rot. Snow's purity isn't just about genetics or polished capital manners, it's ideological. In his perfect Panem, every person, every district, every victor plays the role he scripted. Lucy Gray sings when he wants, then disappears when she's inconvenient. Katniss plays tragic lover, not revolutionary symbol. Even Seneca Crane's beard becomes part of the story, a stylish face for a controlled nightmare. Anyone who disrupts that story, contamination, a song that doesn't end on his cue, a tribute who inspires hope instead of fear. A district that remembers it has more in common with other districts than with the capital. You can see why he clings to rituals and pageantry. The parade, the interviews, the victor's village tours, each one is a disinfectant pass over the raw wound of the dark days. His fear of chaos is not abstract political theory. It's the memory of empty cupboards, the smell of his grandfather's failing legacy. The 10th Games, where he's too afraid to face real danger himself, so he manipulates from the stands and learns the real lesson: if you control the rules, you never have to step into the arena. From then on, every unpredictable element feels lethal. A song, a mockingjay, a girl with a bow. And by Katniss's era, there's a new terror layered on top: irrelevance. Snow isn't just afraid the districts will rebel. He's afraid they'll move on without him, that Panem's story will swap out his face for a new symbol, a new president, a new promise. Why else is he so fixated on being the one to allow reforms, to manage the narrative of mercy, to frame every shift as his calculated generosity? When Katniss becomes the girl on fire, he doesn't only see a threat to order. He sees a rival author, someone rewriting his script in real time. He keeps underestimating one thing: symbols don't respect term limits. They outlive presidents. They outlive roses. And the real question hanging over all of this is simple. What happens to a man who's built his entire relationship to power on being remembered when the story starts forgetting him? Hope versus fear. Inside Snow's conversation with Seneca Crane, so when the story starts forgetting him, where does Snow go? He goes to the garden, to the roses, to the one place he controls every frame. You remember the scene. Seneca Crane, new head game maker, walking through that manicured maze of white. Snow trimming his roses with the same calm you'd use to adjust a tie. At face value, it's just a performance review with better landscaping. But here's the real question. Why does Snow choose this setting to explain the entire operating system of Panem? He doesn't open with threats. He opens with philosophy. He asks why we need a victor at all. Why not just round up the rebels' children every year and execute them? Why the arena, the spectacle, the promise of survival? Snow already knows the answer, of course. Seneca thinks the games are entertainment. Snow knows they're irrigation. He's managing the flow of hope and fear through every district. Then he drops the line: hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. He pauses. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. It sounds clever enough to print on a capital mug, but that part matters because it's not theory to him. It's autobiography. That sentence is a starving boy from a ruined family, weaponized. Back then, young Coriolanus survived on crumbs. Not just food, but possibility. A scholarship that might come through. A patron who might notice him. Lucy Gray winning the 10th Games and maybe dragging his name upward with hers. He never had security. He had slivers. Tiny conditional maybes that kept him compliant, desperate, and willing to do anything. So why would he give the districts anything different? This is where we talk about his logic. Pure fear? That's unstable. If people believe they're dead anyway, they stop following rules. They riot, they martyr themselves, they burn the capital's trains. Pure hope? Just as bad. If districts think they deserve comfort and safety, they start treating the capital as a service provider, not a god. They make demands. They expect rights. Snow's solution is the same one that got him through childhood, a strictly rationed dose of hope, always tied to the games, always revocable. So we're going to cover what that looks in practice. Victor's villages on the hill, visible from every coal-dusted street. Feasts when a district wins, but only then. Tours where a victor returns home as proof the system works, while peacekeepers stand just off camera. The relationship is clear. Fear keeps you in line. Hope keeps you moving. Pattern interrupt for a second. Because isn't it darkly funny that the man most terrified of chaos designs an annual arena of chaos? But that contradiction is the point. The chaos is fenced in, timed, televised. Snow learned in the 10th games that if you put horror in a box and label it tradition, people will schedule their lives around it. By the time he's lecturing Seneca, the garden is Panem in miniature, roses bred, pruned, and poisoned to his exact specifications. One victor per year, one village per district, one narrow path between terror and aspiration that everyone is forced to walk. And the next question is obvious. What happens when a tribute walks off that path on live television and turns his carefully measured little hope into something much bigger? Why allow volunteers at all? The meta question Snow had to answer. What happens when a tribute walks off that path and turns a little hope into something bigger? To answer that, we have to rewind to a deceptively simple design choice. Why did Snow's Panem even allow volunteers in the first place? At face value, it sounds counterproductive. If the capital's goal is to punish the districts, why let anyone step in? Why not drag 2 terrified kids at random every year? No escape, no substitutions, maximum dread. Why give the poorest, angriest people in your empire even the illusion of choice? Here's the real question. What happens to the games if there is no choice at all? Imagine a Panem where volunteering is illegal, no career districts, no kids raised on spears and sponsor lessons, no siblings jumping in to save each other, just a reaping, a scream, and a train. Short-term, fear spikes. Parents hide their children. Tesserae looks even more monstrous. But long-term, the whole system gets brittle. Because without volunteers, the games stop being a competition you can prepare for and become a pure lottery of suffering. You can't train for random. You can't strategize around chaos. And Snow, the boy who survived the 10th games by treating chaos as a puzzle to solve, understands that better than anyone. There is a lot to uncover here about his relationship with risk. Volunteers are his solution. They turn a one-sided massacre into a twisted opportunity. If you can choose to enter, then in theory, you can choose to win. You can train your child to be a career tribute. You can chase the promise of food for your district. You can convince yourself that your odds are better than the kid next door. The capital doesn't just select victims, it invites applications. That part matters because it shifts the emotional center of the games. Fear doesn't disappear, but it gets braided with ambition and pride. Especially in the richer districts, the arena becomes the biggest stage for personal glory. Kids who might have led protests are now leading training exercises. Parents channel their terror into coaching. Rebellion energy gets redirected inward, toward beating other districts, not overthrowing the system that set the rules. This is where we talk about Snow's favorite equation. Hope plus fear. Too much fear, and people break. Too much hope, and they revolt. Volunteering is his way of rationing both. You're still terrified of the reaping, but you also watch the parade and think, if it has to be someone, maybe it could be my kid. Maybe we could win. And to sell that fantasy, you need more than a sword and a slogan. You need a prize, a house, a future, a whole neighborhood that proves the games are a path upward, not just a pit. So to really see how volunteering locks into this system, we're going to cover Snow's most seductive invention, the Victor's Village. Victor's Village, Snow's golden cage for survivors. Winning the Hunger Games earns you a mansion in the Victor's Village. On paper, That sounds generous. So why does it feel so sinister the second you zoom out? You think back to the early games, pre-10th, when a victor went home with nothing but trauma and maybe a slightly better food ration for a week. No house, no steady income, no visible upgrade that a starving kid in the seam or the hob could point to and say, that's why you volunteer. So why the change? Why suddenly pour capital resources into suburban cul-de-sacs for killers? This is where we talk about Snow turning his student scheming into urban planning. After the 10th games, after he'd proved to Dr. Gaul and the capital elite that spectacle could be profitable, Snow understands the core problem. Fear alone is unstable. People under constant terror snap. They riot. They stop cooperating. So he takes what he learned as a hungry teenager, terrified of losing status, and scales it up. You don't just punish the districts, you sell them a dream. The nicest houses in each district, set apart from the slums, with electricity that actually works, hot water, full pantries and furniture that doesn't splinter, at face value, it's almost capital-adjacent living. Wide streets, manicured lawns, enough space that you can forget for a second the coal dust or lumber rot or fish stench hanging over the rest of town. Any kid can look up at District 12's hilltop suburb and see the promise. If someone wins, they move there forever. But here's the real question. Why does the capital care enough to build a luxury neighborhood for people it just spent weeks trying to kill on television? Because for Snow, the village isn't a reward. It's infrastructure for control. For the districts, it functions as a billboard. Your child could live like this. No more reaping. No more tesserae. Maybe even extra food for everyone when they win. There is a lot to uncover here, but that part matters because it flips the emotional script. The games stop being a pure horror and become a horrible opportunity. You don't just dread the arena, you secretly hope it might save your family. For Snow, though, the design is a cage. Victors are pulled out of their communities and placed on display, separated physically and socially. They're exempt from the mines or the fields, but not from the capital. They get direct lines to the city, mandatory mentoring, media duties, and constant surveillance. You're free to walk your perfect street. You're not free to walk away. And this is cowardice, scaled up into architecture. Instead of facing the moral horror of the games, Snow builds a pretty neighborhood to wallpaper over the bodies that paid for it. He doesn't make the system less cruel. He makes the brochure more convincing. But what happens when that brochure tears? When the village itself becomes a battlefield instead of a prize? How Victor's village hacks the human brain. Victor's village isn't just a neighborhood. It's a psychological experiment you're forced to walk past every day. Start with temptation. In a district where children die for bread, a mansion with hot water and full pantries is not subtle propaganda. You watch Katniss's mother go from a cramped seam kitchen to a stocked Victor's house. And suddenly, the games don't only mean death, they also mean a chance, however tiny, that your family never starves again. That part matters because Snow understands hunger. As a teenager, he was secretly starving in the capital, terrified of losing status. He knows exactly how powerful a full plate looks to an empty stomach. But here's the real question. Why put that wealth on display instead of hiding Victor's away in the capital? Because Victor's village has to be visible to work. It's placed on a hill in District 12, apart from the soot and the shacks, close enough for children to see the big windows, and the electricity too far to ever touch it. At face value, it's a reward. In practice, it's a billboard. This is what obedience can buy you. The village doesn't just separate victors from the capital, it separates them from their own district. You move the one person who survived the arena into a fenced-off suburb, give them better rations, different clothes, direct phone lines to the capital. Suddenly, the victor isn't one of us anymore. They're the person who gets to mentor, travel, attend parties in the capital. You can resent them and envy them at the same time, which is perfect if you're Snow and you're terrified of unified districts. This is where we talk about the illusion of safety. On paper, victors are untouchable. No more reapings, permanent housing, guaranteed income. In reality, Haymitch drinks himself into oblivion because he knows Snow killed his family for outsmarting the arena. Finnick is paraded as capital arm candy, his real relationships weaponized against him. Johanna's loved ones are tortured, then she's tortured anyway. The message is brutal. The house is safe. You aren't. So why does this system still produce volunteers? Because the promise works on a different part of the brain. You don't volunteer because you think the games are fair. You volunteer because you think you can beat them. Career districts raise children on the myth that they're built for the arena, and Victor's village is the physical proof that the myth pays off. Snow channels courage into his own machine, turning potential rebels into tributes who willingly enter a structure he controls. And here's the quiet cowardice under all of it. Snow doesn't want to face strong-willed people in open conflict. He wants them to walk into his arena, move into his houses, sign his contracts. He'd rather poison from a distance than duel in the street. Victor's village is that poison in architectural form, slow, sweet, and designed so you thank him while it kills you. But what happens when a victor stops thanking him and starts using that house as a base for war instead of a trophy? District 12, when the system fails to seduce. In District 12, that house of war is mostly empty. You walk into Victor's village and it feels wrong. 12 identical mansions, full power, hot water, gleaming appliances, and for decades, almost no one to use them. At face value, this is the same dream suburb Snow builds everywhere. But here's the real question. What does it mean when the capital's favorite tool of control sits abandoned on a hill, collecting dust? For years, Haymitch is the only occupant. One victor, one drunk, one decaying house with broken bottles and peeling wallpaper, surrounded by 11 pristine shells. Then suddenly Katniss and Peter move in, and you go from one lit window to 3. That part matters because Victor's village is supposed to be a spectacle. Kids are meant to stare up at those houses and think, if I volunteer, that could be mine. In 12, most kids stare and think, that's where people go to be haunted. So why doesn't the system take here? Why does this district, out of all of them, refuse the bait? We're going to cover 3 big reasons, and they all expose the limits of Snow's design. First, the poverty is absolute. In the seam, you're trading tesserae for survival, not dreaming of marble countertops. When your daily question is, do we eat? The promise of future luxury doesn't land. It feels abstract, almost insulting. The games aren't an opportunity, they're a death sentence that might throw your family a few coins on the way to your execution. Second, District 12 is physically and culturally far from the capital. Number regular parades of stylists. No constant influx of peacekeepers bragging about career academies. The relationship to the games is distant, grainy, something you see on a flickering screen once a year. The pageantry doesn't saturate the culture the way it does in 1, 2, or 4, so Snow's psychological hooks, the glory, the fame, the honor of volunteering, barely catch. Third, the culture of 12 is built on quiet survival, not spectacle. You keep your head down, you poach outside the fence, you pretend you don't know your neighbor is trading at the hob. Volunteering would mean stepping into the spotlight on purpose. Who does that in a place where attention usually gets you whipped or worse? And this is where we talk about POV bias. Because we live the story through Katniss, a girl from a non-volunteering district, the entire game system reads as pure terror. We see no career academies. We almost never see kids racing each other to the stage. There is a lot to uncover here about how that distorts our sense of how effective Snow's architecture really is. District 12 is the outlier, not the norm. But even in the outlier, Snow adapts. He turns Katniss's accidental volunteering into a love story, her survival into a symbol, her house into a stage set. He uses broadcasts from that nearly empty village to sell hope, and then to threaten her, reminding her that everything she loves lives on his hill. So if this is how much damage he can do, where the system underperforms, what happens in a district where it works exactly as designed? Career districts, when Snow's plan works too well. In District 12, Victor's village is a ghost suburb with 3 haunted mansions. But travel to Districts 1, 2, and 4, and you're in a different universe. The streets are lit, the houses are full. Children point at Victor's windows, the way you might point at movie stars. And here's the real question. What happens when the punishment becomes the dream? This is where we talk about career tributes. In most districts, your name in the reaping is a death sentence you spend your whole childhood trying to avoid. In the career districts, children train for it. They lift weights, throw spears, swim currents, memorize past arenas. Then, when the reaping comes, they don't pray not to be chosen. They volunteer. Why? Because in 1, 2, and 4, the arena is sold as a path to status, honor, and a permanent seat in those shining houses on the hill. At face value, Victor's village finally looks how the capital brochure promised. Every house occupied, gardens actually weeded, Victors walking around as local royalty instead of traumatized shut-ins. The district throws parades when they come home. Children grow up watching Glimmer or Cato or Finnick on replay and thinking, that could be me. The relationship between district and Victor flips. Instead of seeing them as capital-made weapons, they're hometown heroes. That part matters because the entire environment is built to reinforce that story. The village isn't off in some forgotten corner. It's visible, aspirational, woven into daily life. You pass it on the way to the training center. Your school points to it when they talk about hard work and glory. The message is simple. Win, and you get out of the mines, the quarries, the fishing boats. Win, and you never worry about the reaping again. So how do you make sure people are ready to win? You bend the rules without ever admitting you're bending them. Officially, pre-games training is forbidden. Unofficially, Districts 1, 2, and 4 have youth sports programs, militia drills, fishing academies that just happen to teach combat, survival, and weapon skills. Peacekeepers look the other way. Capital officials enjoy the spectacle too much to ask why a 12-year-old can throw a trident. Over time, this creates a social pipeline. You start in the junior classes, you move up to elite training, your family gets status if you're promising. By the time you're 16, volunteering feels less like a sacrifice and more like a graduation ceremony. We're going to cover how Snow uses hope as a weapon, and this is the clearest example. He doesn't have to drag tributes here. They run. From Snow's perspective, this is perfection. These districts internalize his system so completely, they police themselves. Parents brag about their children's kill scores. Trainers enforce discipline harsher than any peacekeeper. The games become a self-sustaining tradition, a religion of merit and murder that doesn't require extra force to maintain. Why waste troops when peer pressure will do? But there is a lot to uncover here, because buried inside Snow's favorite success story is a structural flaw. When you spend decades building the strongest, fastest, most tactically trained teenagers in Panem, you're not just creating better tributes, you're creating the only people physically capable of challenging the capital. The careers become peacekeepers. The careers man the nut in District 2. The careers learn the capital's tactics and how to break them. So what happens when the children raised to worship the games start asking who really deserves to be in the arena? The invisible middle, districts we never see up close. So if District 1 and 2 raise the kids who worship the games, what about the districts we barely see? The ones that aren't starving coal miners or polished career factories, but still send children to die every year. Here's the real question. How does Snow keep the machine running in places we never really visit? We have to start by admitting our blind spot. The story locks you into a handful of districts, but Snow's system only works if all 12 keep playing. District 5. 6, 9, 10 don't get full tours, but their trains still arrive, their tributes still walk in the parade, their victors still get a key to some version of Victor's village. At face value, they're background, but there is a lot to uncover here. Take District 6. The morphling-addicted victors in Catching Fire are our biggest clue. You're told they've essentially retreated from reality, using capital drugs to drown out what they did and what was done to them. That part matters because it shows a mid-tier district where the promise of victory didn't create glamorous celebrities. It created broken mascots the capital can both pity and exploit. You can almost see their victor's village. Half-occupied houses, curtains drawn, peacekeepers making sure the pharmacy stays stocked. District 5 and 9 give you a different angle. Their tributes aren't career-level polished, but they're not as clueless as early-game District 12 either. They know how the arena works. They know the odds. In the training center, some of them joke, some posture, some just go through the motions. So what culture produces that attitude? Probably a district where the games are a grim lottery, not a holy calling. You dread being chosen, but when someone wins, you still throw a harvest party because the capital sends extra food. This is where we talk about those invisible victors' villages. They're probably patchwork places. One or two local legends who actually lean into their role, a couple of traumatized recluses, and several empty houses waiting for tributes who never make it home. Enough visible wealth to keep children staring over the fence. Not enough glamour to threaten capital stars. And across these districts, you get a cultural gradient. Some families treat the games as a cursed duty you pray to avoid. Others treat them as a sick kind of raffle. Every year you ask, will the capital finally notice us? Will our district get a victor and a year of being on screen? That uneven relationship to the games is the point. Snow doesn't need every district to love the games. He just needs them to feel differently about them. If District 2 sees the arena as promotion, and District 6 sees it as a slow suicide, and District 9 is somewhere in between, how do they ever unite on a single demand? They don't. And that's the cowardly genius here. A man too afraid to face open war builds a map where no two regions hate him in exactly the same way. So what happens when one girl from an invisible non-career district suddenly gives all of them the same symbol to rally around? Katniss the volunteer. When Snow's feature becomes a bug. Katniss volunteering is one of those scenes you think you understand. Sister steps up, music swells, everyone cries. But here's the real question. Why does this one word, I volunteer, hit Snow's system harder than any career tribute ever has? At face value, volunteering is the capital's dream mechanic. It turns the games from a pure lottery into a rigged talent show. Ambitious teens from the career districts throw themselves in for glory, for wealth, for a mansion in Victor's village, and a permanent escape from the reaping. The capital promises, suffer once, and if you win, you're safe. That part matters because it gives the districts a reason to hope instead of revolt. But go back to the reaping in District 12. Katniss doesn't step forward for status. She doesn't even hesitate long enough to calculate odds. She moves because Prim screams, because the relationship between them matters more than her own survival. Her motive is love first, rage second, and ambition not at all. She wants nothing the capital is selling. That's a problem. Snow's whole volunteering model assumes a certain kind of tribute, someone who wants something from him, a better life for their family, fame, sponsorships, the promise of becoming a victor who can drink, mentor, and phone the capital whenever they want. When you want something, you can be bargained with. So why is Katniss so dangerous? Because she walks in already resigned to die, as long as Prim doesn't. This is where we talk about misreading. The capital sees a volunteer and instantly runs the career playbook. They dress her up in fire, brand her as the girl on fire, shove her into interviews, and assume she'll play along because who doesn't want to be adored on television? To them, she's a rough-edged District 12 version of a District 1 tribute. A little feral but still a performer. There is a lot to uncover here. Every step where they think they're shaping her, she's actually refusing the script. The silent salute to Rue's district. Decorating Rue's body with flowers. None of those are career moves. They're Lucy Gray moves. Personal, symbolic, rooted in grief and defiance rather than strategy for sponsors. Snow feels that echo. He's seen a girl from nowhere turn a punishment into a story before. Lucy Gray made a song into a weapon. Katniss turns a handful of berries into an ultimatum broadcast to all 12 districts. Same pattern, upgraded aim. If one tribute can force the capital to break its own rules on live television, what happens when every district notices? And here's the twist. Volunteering, Snow's proud feature, is what lets this happen. A tribute who enters the arena already willing to die for something other than the capital's approval is fundamentally ungovernable. The system that was supposed to funnel ambition into obedience has accidentally opened a door for martyrdom. So what does a coward who built his power on control do when his own rules start manufacturing people who aren't afraid of him at all? Community fallout. What a victor really does to a district. So when the games start producing people who aren't afraid of him, Snow doesn't shut the system down. He doubles down on the parts that keep everyone else afraid. This is where we talk about what a victor actually does to a district, not in the arena. At home, because the moment that train pulls back into the station, the whole place is temporarily rewritten. You get the parades, the banners, the music. There's suddenly meat on every table, sugar in every kitchen, oil in every lamp. For a few days, the district tastes a different life. At face value, that looks generous. Your kid survives, your neighbors eat, the peacekeepers relax a little. But here's the real question. Why does the capital flood a starving district with food only when someone wins its death lottery? The reason is simple and cruel. Snow is teaching you to associate relief, not with rebellion, not with unity, but with a single chosen body coming home alive. And then the feast ends. The banners come down, the mines reopen, the factories roar, and what's left behind is architecture. A mansion, maybe 12 of them. In District 12, they sit on a hill, clean streets and working power, while the seam chokes on coal dust below. Every walk to the square, every trip to trade, you pass that fence and those perfect windows. The relationship between victor and district stops being abstract. Inequality has a literal address. That part matters because Snow understands visibility. Hunger is bad, but hunger next to abundance is worse. It breeds obsession. Parents don't just fear the reaping, they stare at that house and think, maybe my child, maybe my name on that doorbell. The promise isn't, maybe the games will end, it's, maybe we'll win them. Meanwhile, the person in that mansion doesn't get to disappear. A victor becomes a forced mentor, a permanent fixture of the games. Haymitch is dragged out year after year, drunk or not, to polish new tributes for slaughter. Katniss is pushed into propaganda, then into being the Mockingjay. They're given direct lines to the capital, but those are leashes, not privileges. And between all of that they become reluctant providers. Katniss sneaking under District 12's fence to hunt, trading games so other families don't starve while the official reward food runs out. So what does that do socially? It splits people. Some see the victor as a sellout who plays along with Snow's cameras. Others treat them as a savior, the only proof that the system can occasionally work for someone from here. There is a lot to uncover here. Resentment toward the rich houses, hero worship of the person inside, and quiet terror that your survival might depend on their next interview going well. Snow loves that fracture. It keeps districts arguing over whether to worship or hate their victors instead of asking why the games exist at all. And he's not done weaponizing that tension yet, because the next step in his plan takes that mansion on the hill and turns it into something even darker. Haymitch, Finnick, Johanna, broken pieces of Snow's machine. Victor's village looks empty enough in District 12, but the real haunted houses in Panem are the people Snow puts inside them. This is where we talk about Haymitch, Finnick, and Johanna. 3 winners. 3 case studies in how Snow turns "you survived" into "you belong to me." At face value, they're proof the system works. Look closer, and you're staring at the wreckage of Snow's fear. Start with Haymitch, 16 years old in the second quarter quell, facing that force field cliff. He does the one thing Snow hates most. He thinks for himself. He tests the barrier with a rock, realizes it's a weapon, and uses the arena's own design to kill the last tribute. The crowd cheers. The game makers are impressed. But here's the real question. What does Snow see? A boy who just exposed that the arena isn't divine punishment. It's a fallible machine. Snow can't let that stand, so his revenge is slow and personal. Haymitch's mother, his younger brother, his girlfriend, picked off one by one after the games. The message is simple. Your cleverness killed them. That part matters because it turns Haymitch's victory into a curse he has to drink away just to function. His alcoholism isn't just a character flaw, it's self-defense against a capital that weaponized his own brain against him. Then there's Finnick O'Dare, the capital's golden boy. On camera, he's the promise the games sell to every district. Win young, become a legend, drown in sugar cubes and adoration. Off camera, he's being sold. Snow turns him into a commodity, a sex slave passed around to powerful citizens, with threats against Annie and his loved ones as the leash. We're going to cover poison later, but Finnick already knows the pattern. Snow uses secrets the way he uses venom, slowly, precisely, always with deniability. Finnick's knowledge of Snow's poison politics, who died, who got sick, who was outmaneuvered, shows you the rot under the polished victor image. The relationship between Snow and his victors isn't mentor and champion. It's blackmailer and hostage. Johanna Mason blows up the script entirely. She doesn't pretend to be grateful. She wins by acting weak, then revealing she's anything but, and she never hides her hatred of the capital. So Snow upgrades the punishment. In prison, they torture her, strip her, flood her with water to break her connection to the trees, and take away the one thing she used to feel safe, her own mind. She comes back shaking, furious, still unbroken enough to be dangerous, but too traumatized to ever be fully free. So why keep these people alive at all? Because Snow needs them as advertisements and as warnings. Victor's village, the interviews, the luxury, the constant cameras, those are the rewards that keep the dream of hope alive in the districts. But the dead lovers, the forced prostitution, the torture, those are the reminders that no one ever really leaves the games. Snow is a coward with power. He's too afraid to let strong people simply exist. He has to fracture them just enough that they'll never be a real threat, even if it means ruling over a haunted, traumatized elite. And if that's what he does to the winners, what does he plan for the rest of Panem when the illusion finally cracks? No versus coin. when two cowards collide. So when the illusion finally cracks, who steps into the gap? Not a hero. President Coin. At face value, she looks like Snow's opposite. Grey instead of roses, underground instead of palaces, war rooms instead of parties. But here's the real question. Why does Snow recognize her so quickly as his replacement? Coin is Snow's mirror. She also runs on scarcity, control, and spectacle. Snow has the Hunger Games and the Victory Tour. Coin has propos and televised executions. Snow dangles the promise of a victor's mansion. Both are selling hope on a screen to keep their people moving in the direction they want. That part matters because it means Snow isn't confused about what he built. He sees the same blueprint in District 13 and calls it immediately. This is where we talk about Snow's conversation with Katniss in the Rose Garden. He basically tells her, "I'm not your only problem. Coin will do exactly what I did, just wearing a different uniform." Why does he say that? It's not remorse. It's professional assessment. He understands the relationship between fear and loyalty so well that he can spot another practitioner from across a battlefield. When he says the rebels aren't planning to destroy the game system, just inherit it, he's explaining his own ideology better than any capital speech. But their methods aren't identical. Snow prefers slow poison, both literal and political. He uses carefully rationed hope, controlled comforts, and the constant threat of the arena. Coin leans toward direct militarized control. She's comfortable with mass bombings, strict schedules, and a culture where every citizen is a soldier. Snow wants you terrified but entertained. Coin wants you obedient and useful. Snow uses them in the arena, but he keeps the violence framed as the games, ritualized and contained. Coin signs off on a bombing that targets capital children as a symbol, then proposes a final Hunger Games using capital kids as a political gesture. Why? Because for her, symbolism is worth real bodies, as long as it secures power. Snow watches that vote and doesn't look shocked. He looks vindicated. So why does he finally tell Katniss the truth about Prim? When he's captured, strapped to a chair, Snow suddenly becomes honest about the parachute bombs. He insists they weren't his. That Coin ordered the strike. It isn't kindness. It's a bitter need to expose her hypocrisy and prove that the new regime runs on the same cowardice he does, just with different branding. And that's the end of his arc. The boy who survived by rigging the 10th Games grows into the man who industrializes fear, and he dies pointing at the next monster. Snow's warning about Coin proves he always knew exactly what he was. Not a necessary evil, not fate, just one coward in a system that can always grow another. So if the monster is replaceable, what does it actually take to break the machine instead of just swapping who's driving it? Is Snow a villain, a victim, or both? So if the monster is replaceable, what does it actually take to break the machine instead of just swapping who's driving it? To answer that, we have to zoom out from Snow the symbol and stare at Snow the starving teenager for a second. Because before he's the president of Panem, he's a boy counting grains of sugar in a ruined apartment. His family name still opens doors, but there's nothing behind them. The war has gutted the capital's wealth. The Snows are freezing hungry, sewing their clothes back together while pretending everything is fine. The games already exist. The districts are already broken. The system is already cruel before he ever touches it. At face value, you could argue he's a product of that world. Everyone in Panem is moving under the same storm cloud of fear and scarcity. The peacekeepers in District 12, the stylists in the capital, the kids in the hob trading squirrels for bread. They're all shaped by the same threat. Step out of line, and the games will remind you who's in charge. So here's the real question. If the environment is this brutal, how much blame do you put on the individual who learns to be brutal back? There is a lot to uncover here, because Snow's not the only one who's hungry. Tigris is hungry. Sejanus is horrified. Lucy Gray is cornered. Most of them don't become future dictators. That part matters because it kills the excuse that he had no choice. Plenty of people in the capital and the districts face the same terror and still draw a line somewhere. Snow keeps erasing the line. In the 10th games, when he could push for mercy or reform as a student, he pushes for spectacle. He turns the arena into a show, not a graveyard. Later, when he could negotiate with dissenters, he reaches for poison. His own mouth sores are a physical record of how many times he chose subtle murder over honest conflict. Once he has power, when he finally isn't starving, he still chooses fear over reform, roses over truth, order over justice. So put yourself in his place for a moment. You're a teenager in a collapsing capital, your family's status is a mask over an empty pantry, and you're surrounded by vultures who would happily watch you fall. How far do you go to survive? Do you rig a few exams? Sabotage a rival? Poison a mentor? Where exactly do you draw the line between survival and monstrosity? This is where we talk about your own reaction to him. Was there a moment in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes where you thought, he's gone, there's no coming back? Was it Lucy Gray in the woods? Sejanus on the gallows? Or did the original trilogy hit you harder? Maybe the roses in Katniss's house? The bombing of 12? Or Prim in the Capitol? We're going to cover how those specific choices lock in his legacy next. But I want you to think about the exact scene where your sympathy snapped or sparked. Because once you know that moment for yourself, the next step is asking whether Panem ever gave anyone the tools to choose differently. And that's where Snow's story gets even darker. Book versus movie Snow? How adaptation changes the monster. So when did Snow stop being a scared teenager in a ruined penthouse and become the calm monster you see on screen? Here's the real question. Does the version in your head come from the page? Or from Donald Sutherland's smile? Book Snow, especially in Ballad, is almost uncomfortably close. You're in his head while he's starving, scheming, and constantly calculating his odds of survival. Every choice is framed as necessity. He tells himself he deserves power because the Snows already paid in blood during the war, because chaos is worse than cruelty, because order is the only way the districts and the capital don't tear each other apart. There is a lot to uncover here, because the text lets you hear the exact moment fear turns into rationalization. He's terrified in the arena during the 10th games, but notice how he manages that terror. He avoids direct risk, sends other people in first, and then reaps maximum reward when things go his way. On the page, you see the constant loop: fear, justification, then a tiny hit of relief when his plan works. That part matters because it makes his future poisonings feel less theatrical and more inevitable. Of course, this boy grows into a man who never fights fair. Now compare that to movie Snow. At face value, Donald Sutherland plays him as your unsettling grandfather at a holiday dinner. Soft voice, perfect manners, a hand on your shoulder that feels both reassuring and inescapable. He smiles through threats to Seneca Crane. He speaks to Katniss about hope and unity. And the horror is that he sounds reasonable. The performance leans hard into image control. You're watching a man who knows the cameras are always on, even in his own garden. Here's the twist. The original films actually soften some of the book's physical monstrosity, the constant mouth sores from poison, the smell of blood he's trying to cover. The text keeps reminding you of that decay. The movies keep the roses but mostly skip the gore. It's a cleaner Snow which slightly downplays the cost of his methods, even as the roses still whisper, "Something here is rotting." What the films add, though, is visual obsession. The roses, the white suit, the balcony over the games, the way he's just watching, no weapon in his hand, no direct fight, just surveillance. This is where we talk about Snow as an observer, not a victor of any arena. The opulent settings turn every scene into a reminder of the relationship between his comfort and district suffering. So which version is truer? The one where you hear the fear, or the one where you only see the mask? Maybe the reason both feel right is that they agree on one core rule of Snow. He's most dangerous when he's still, composed, pretending everything is under control, because that's when he's hiding the most fear. And in the next section, we're going to cover how he turns that private terror into a public system that swallows all of Panem. Inside the victor's mansion, daily life in Snow's golden cage. So when Snow turns that private terror into a public system, where do you actually feel it? You don't feel it in the arena. You feel it in the kitchen, in the hot shower. In the fully stocked pantry you open at midnight and realize every can on this shelf has a body count. At face value, Victor's village is a dream. Large kitchens with multiple ovens, running water on demand, electricity that doesn't flicker, pantries filled with coffee, sugar, real meat. In District 12, that's not comfort, that's science fiction. But here's the real question. Why design victory as a house tour of everything you almost died to touch? Every light switch is a reminder, the game's paid for this. Any victor will tell you the routine is where the trap really tightens. You wake up in silk sheets, but your calendar is owned by the capital. Mentoring season, you're back on the train, back in the remake center, selling hope to a new set of doomed kids. Off-season, capital visits, school assemblies, harvest festivals. You're wheeled out whenever Snow wants to refresh the relationship between spectacle and obedience. Then the cameras leave. And this is where we talk about the quiet days, the empty mansion, the echo in Haymitch's hallway because no one else lives there. You have no shift at the mines, no factory whistle, no reason to get out of bed except the next set of games you can't stop. That part matters because trauma doesn't stay in the arena. It rushes in when there's finally nothing else on the schedule. Snow knows that. He knows your weak points, your mother's medicine, your sister's job, your district's food shipments. There is a lot to uncover here about surveillance that never needs obvious cameras. The phone that rings directly from the capital. The peacekeeper who just happens to patrol past your gate. The sense that at any moment, a hovercraft could land on your front lawn and your carefully arranged life is over. So how do you live in a golden cage? You improvise. Haymitch drinks until the days blur, his spotless kitchen buried under broken glass and spilled liquor. Annie retreats into an inner world where the waves and Finnick are still safe, because the present is unbearable. Johanna weaponizes anger. If they've already taken your family, what else can they threaten? Each coping mechanism is both rebellion and surrender, a way to be a person and a product at the same time. And Snow is thrilled. This is his ideal outcome. Not dead rebels, but living exhibits. Victor's village turns survivors into walking proof that the system works. Children in the district see the mansion on the hill and think, maybe, if I volunteer, that could be me. They don't see the nightmares behind the curtains. We're going to cover how that illusion finally cracks with the quarter quell, but inside these houses you can already feel the promise of safety starting to rot. Designing every district's Victor's village. Speculative tour. So if the promise is already rotting, you have to ask, what does that mansion on the hill look like everywhere else in Panem? Because Snow doesn't just copy-paste District 12's Victor's village onto the map. He customizes the fantasy. This is where we talk about Districts 1 and 2. Career country. You can almost see their villages shimmering on the horizon. Polished stone, fountains, manicured courtyards. At face value, they're the success stories. The games are sold as a noble path, a respectable career move. You don't just become a victor, You become local aristocracy. The parties never really stop. The capital trains roll in, and the relationship between victor and district elite is almost seamless. Why would you rebel when the system has already told you you're its favorite child? But here's the real question. How do you sell that same dream to a place built on salt and storms? In District 4, the wealth is water-based, so Snow leans into coastal luxury. You can imagine whitewashed villas overlooking the sea, terraces hung with nets that never have to be mended, seafood that isn't rationed but plated. Victors, there are legends, hometown heroes whose winnings blend into an already higher baseline of living, so the resentment is softer, more under the surface. Why burn down the games when your champion feeds the whole port for a week after every victory? Then you move inland to the industrial brains of Panem, Districts 3 and 5. The fantasy has to shift. You can't promise marble palaces in a place that smells like machine oil and ozone. So the villages here are cleaner, sharper, still utilitarian but unmistakably upgraded. Full power, experimental tech, working appliances when the rest of the district deals with blackouts. The message is clear. If your specialized skills keep you alive in the arena, you can win the system. That part matters because Snow is quietly telling the nerds and technicians, the people who could hack or sabotage, that the safest path is cooperation. And then you hit the agricultural and resource districts. 7, 9, 10, 11. Logging camps, grain fields, cattle lots, endless rows of crops. The victors' villages here, their oases dropped into exhaustion, a ring of houses with real roofs in a landscape of shacks and bunkhouses, running water where the pickers are thirsty, shade trees where the field hands are burning. Every contrast is visual propaganda. You see the laborers bent double, then you see the victor's porch swing barely moving. It's cruel on purpose. There is a lot to uncover here, but the pattern is simple. Snow doesn't need one perfect design. He needs a dream that feels just plausible enough in each district to keep hope on life support. Not too distant, not too honest. So when the quarter quell comes and he rips that dream away, what happens to all these customized fantasies scattered across Panem? Pattern break. What if Snow had chosen differently? What if, in one of those scattered fantasies, the dream actually worked on Snow himself? This is where we talk about the woods. Not the arena, not the capital, but that quiet, messy human moment with Lucy Gray. Gun in his hand, poison in his pocket, future dangling. At face value, he chooses what he always chooses: control over connection. But here's the real question. What if, just once, he didn't? Picture the pivot. He hears a branch snap, feels that spike of terror, and instead of firing, he calls her name. No shot, no betrayal. He admits he rigged the games, admits the murder on the train, admits he's terrified of losing everything his family ever was. That part matters because for Snow, confession is scarier than death. So imagine him choosing it anyway. Short term, it's a disaster. They can't go back. The peacekeepers will hunt him for desertion and her for existing. So maybe they run for District 13 rumors, or vanish into some forgotten corner of 12, or die in a ditch 2 days later when the food runs out. The point is, he never steps off a train as the promising capital student who saved the 10th Games. No academy glory, no mentorship under Dr. Gall, no accelerated path from star pupil to quiet game maker puppet master. The relationship with poison ends in that forest, not in a career of elegant murders masked by roses. So what happens to the games without him? Back then, they're crude, glitchy punishments, more public execution than religion. Without Snow's cowardly genius smoothing the edges, they might stay that way, bloody, boring, easier for districts to ignore. or openly resent. We're going to cover how he later turns them into appointment viewing, but remove that one architect and the whole structure looks shakier. Maybe there's no victor's village strategy, no carefully engineered promise that becoming a victor means food, status, and a phone line to the capital. The games remain terrifying, but they never become aspirational. Careers don't form the same way. Volunteering stays rare outside a few brutal districts. Hope never gets weaponized into a loyalty program. But here's the twist you don't really want. Power doesn't just evaporate because Snow runs into the trees. Someone fills that vacuum. Maybe it's Gaul herself, doubling down on pure spectacle and raw terror, no pretense of mercy. Maybe it's a blunter president who doesn't bother with roses or speeches about order and purity, just more bombs, more whips, more public hangings. So would Panem actually be better? Or do you just trade one slow, poisonous system for a louder, shorter nightmare? Here's the real question. Is a regime built on addictive games and controlled hope worse than one that doesn't care if the districts watch at all, as long as they obey? There is a lot to uncover here, because in that forest, Snow had one chance to be brave in the honest way, not the capital way. He didn't take it, but the horror of Panem isn't only that he chose wrong, it's that the system had 10 other monsters ready if he hadn't. Did Katniss actually break Snow's system? So if the system could just plug in 10 other monsters, did Katniss actually break anything Snow built? Or did she just prove his worst fears about symbols were correct? This is where we talk about how Snow sees her. He never treats Katniss as a military threat. She's not a general, she's a girl with a bow. What terrifies him is the narrative, the image of a starving hunter from a backwoods district who keeps refusing to die on schedule. From the moment of the berries, he reads her as a story problem, not a battlefield problem. That part matters because Snow's whole relationship to power is about controlling the story people tell themselves when they wake up terrified. At face value, the berries are a romantic stunt. Two star-crossed lovers choosing death over the games. But here's the real question. Why does that tiny handful of fruit shake the capital more than a dozen failed uprisings ever did? Because Katniss doesn't just survive, she rewrites the script in real time. The games promise that the capital decides who lives. The berries promise that two tributes can decide together. Suddenly, the districts don't only have a little hope of winning, they have hope that the rules themselves can be bent. Snow scrambles to co-opt it, the star-crossed lovers tour, the wedding dress, the interviews where she has to cry on cue. We're going to cover how similar this is to Victor's village logic. Take something traumatic, lacquer it in spectacle, and sell it back as aspiration. If she plays along, he gets to say, "See, even your rebel symbol just wants a pretty dress and a safe life." When that fails, he tries discrediting her, threatening Gale, burning her district. When that fails, he goes back to his oldest solution. The quarter quell, reaping from existing victors, is Snow trying to slam the hope/fear dial back to maximum fear. You thought being a victor meant safety? No. Your status is now a liability. Your mentor, your idol, your district hero can be thrown back in whenever the capital is annoyed. It's the same trick he learned in the 10th games. Turn survival into a weapon against the survivors. But in doing so, he detonates his own promise. Once that's gone, why should any district believe in the games at all? And then, the rebellion does something very Snow. They take his tools. Coin and Plutarch turn Katniss into the Mockingjay Propos star, complete with costumes, retakes, and carefully scripted emotion. They win the war by beating the capital at its own spectacle, which raises a harder question. If you overthrow a monster using his exact methods, how different is the new system really? Katniss absolutely helps topple Snow. She ruins his balance, breaks his monopoly on fear, and exposes the games as a rigged ritual instead of a natural law. But Coin's smooth slide into his place, her own hunger for control wrapped in for the district's language, suggests the deeper machine survives. You can kill a cowardly man. A culture that runs on fear and cameras is a lot harder to shoot with one arrow. So did Katniss break Snow's system, or just break Snow? To answer that, we have to look at what happens after the roses stop arriving, when the games end on paper but the logic of the arena keeps echoing through Panem's politics. Dying on his own terms. Almost. When the roses stop arriving, something almost stranger takes their place. Silence. Snow, the man who filled the entire country with his voice, ends up in a cell under his own mansion, caged by the very rebels he spent his life trying to keep off his doorstep. You'd expect panic begging some breakdown of that presidential mask. Instead, he's disturbingly composed. He talks. He laughs. He coughs blood on command. And here's the real question. Why is a man who spent decades terrified of death suddenly so calm when it finally catches up? At face value, Snow's capture looks simple. The Capitol falls, the mansion is stormed, the once untouchable president becomes prisoner of war number one. But that part matters because for Snow, physical power was never his only weapon. Conversation was. Narrative was. Even in chains, he knows the games haven't actually ended. They've just changed arenas. So when Katniss walks into that greenhouse of a prison yard, he doesn't see a victor confronting her tormentor. He sees an audience of one, a final camera. This is where we talk about his confession. Snow tells Katniss that Coin ordered the bombing that killed Prim, that the parachutes were rebel design, that he, the monster, actually kept his promise about not lying to her. Does he suddenly grow a conscience? No, he's doing what he's always done, managing risk. If Coin wins uncontested, history paints Snow as pure evil, and Coin as pure salvation. By leaking the truth to Katniss, he injects doubt into the record. He can't save his life, but he might bruise his successor's legacy. That's the last move of a man who fears irrelevance more than execution. Notice his attitude toward his own death. He doesn't beg. He doesn't bargain for exile in some forgotten district. He leans into being honest at the end, positioning himself as the one person who saw through the new regime. It's a twisted kind of hope. If future Panem remembers that he told the truth when Coin did not, then in his mind, he still wins a tiny metagame over history itself. We're going to cover how that obsession with legacy echoes his student days, sabotaging rivals with poison while pretending to be the dutiful capital son. And then the execution happens, and all that careful framing explodes. The plan is simple. Katniss will kill Snow in front of the crowd, a clean reversal of the old games. But chaos doesn't care about anyone's script. The plaza is packed, the tension is electric, and when Katniss raises her bow, she pivots and shoots Coin instead. In a single second, the new order loses its president. The crowd surges, and Snow starts laughing so hard he chokes on his own blood. He isn't ceremonially executed, he's swallowed by the mob, trampled and suffocated in a storm of boots and panic. Poetic justice doesn't get much sharper. The man who built an entire world to avoid chaos dies in the most chaotic, unscripted moment of the revolution. All his cowardly planning, all the roses and poisons and cameras can't control the raw, unpredictable relationship between a furious crowd and a collapsing symbol. And here's the real question. If Snow's final move is to expose Coin, what does Katniss's final arrow expose about the system that comes next? From frightened boy to monster in chief. What Snow teaches us. What does that arrow really hit? Not just Coin, not just Snow, It hits the story Panem's been telling about courage and power from the very beginning. Because when you zoom out, Snow's life is one long attempt to outrun a feeling. Not ambition, not destiny. Fear. You start with a starving capital child, counting every grain of sugar, terrified the capital will notice he doesn't belong in its marble world. Back then, he's not a monster. He's a boy hiding his hunger and praying no one sees him crack. Then we jump to the 10th games. This is where we talk about cowardice as strategy. Snow doesn't charge into the arena. He sends other people. He weaponizes a song, a snake, a romance, anything that keeps his own body off the line. He learns the core lesson: if you can't kill your fear, redirect it. Make someone else carry it for you. That part matters because everything after is just that lesson scaled up to a country. We're going to cover that arc quickly. Student schemer becomes architect of spectacle. He helps turn crude punishment into a ritual the districts can't stop watching. The games become a yearly sermon. The capital is untouchable, the districts are disposable, and your only hope is to become a victor who entertains them enough to live. Victor's Village is the same logic in brick form. At face value, it's a reward. Big houses, hot water, the promise that your family never faces the reaping again. But here's the real question. Why does Snow invest so much in a handful of victors when he could rule with pure terror? Because controlled hope is safer than raw fear. A district dreaming of luxury is too busy competing with itself to unite against the capital. Poison becomes policy. He can't face open conflict, so he turns every dinner into a quiet execution. It scars his mouth, so he buries the smell under roses. The roses aren't just vanity, they are camouflage, a way to pretend rot is perfume. Every bouquet says, nothing's wrong, even as his body literally leaks the cost of his paranoia. And then there are the symbols he can't quite poison. Lucy Gray first, then Katniss. What is he actually afraid of? Not their weapons, their unpredictability. One song in a hanging tree, one girl on fire refusing to play the script, and his whole system of ritual and reward starts to look flimsy. Here's the pattern interrupt. Snow doesn't fall because he finally meets someone braver. He falls because his fear-based machine can't process an unscripted choice. Katniss aiming at coin isn't in any rulebook. That's the real lesson. Systems built on fear and managed hope can look stable for decades, but they depend on everyone believing the script is inevitable. The second a single person in the arena says no, the illusion shakes. So, what does that say about power outside Panem? How often do leaders hide panic behind confidence, or institutions stage their own versions of the games to distract you from the cracks in the foundation? And the harder question, when the script feels rigged, who are we really afraid to aim at? Your turn in the arena. Is Snow justified by his world? So if the script is rigged and everyone's pretending not to see it, here's the real question. What do we do with someone who learns that system from the inside and then perfects it? Is Snow just the worst tribute the arena ever produced, or exactly what the arena was designed to create? At face value, it's easy to file him under monster and move on. Poison, roses, mass murder, case closed. But there is a lot to uncover here. This is where we talk about you. I want you to pause and ask yourself, is Snow purely evil, a victim of his world, or that disturbing third option, a person whose choices you can understand even as you hate them? Where on that spectrum do you put him, and why? To answer that, go back through his story. Which scene actually shifted your view of him the most? Was it the ballad arena? Watching teenage Snow too afraid to step into real danger? Was it him in the rose garden with Katniss, calmly explaining that the games are about hope and fear? in the exact ratio the capital needs? Maybe it's those quiet, awful moments with Katniss on the sofa, where he's almost grandfatherly while describing how her every move will doom a district. Or is it the final revelation about Coin, when he tells Katniss the truth and, infuriatingly, turns out to be right? Tell me which moment did it for you. The arena, the roses, the threats, or the honesty at the end? Because that part matters, because it reveals what you're most sensitive to. Cowardice, cruelty, manipulation, or clarity. Now, push it one step further. Imagine Panem without Snow's particular brand of controlled hope and fear. No roses, no speeches, maybe still the games, but run by someone sloppier or someone who only understands brute force. Do you think the districts rise sooner in a shorter, bloodier nightmare, or does a less talented tyrant cause even more chaos, more dead children, less chance for a Mockingjay to ever appear? In other words, is Snow a uniquely bad outcome, or is he the stable version of something even worse? We're going to cover Coin in more depth, but I want you to weigh in now. Who is more dangerous in the long run, Snow or Coin? Snow turns the games into a ritual, with rules, a horrible promise the districts can predict. Coin is willing to copy the games on the capital's children out of revenge. So whose vision terrifies you more? And what does that say about your relationship to power and justice? Use the comments as our arena. This is our version of the games, where ideas, not tributes, clash. No one has to die, but positions can. Which arguments survive when you put them under pressure? And as we move into the next section, keep one thing in mind. Before Snow became Panem's monster, he was a scared boy in an arena, learning exactly how far terror can carry you. Choose the next tribute: Coin, Lucy Gray, or someone else. And that scared boy in the arena, he doesn't stay alone for long, because now you get to choose who steps into the spotlight next. Think of it as mentoring the next tribute, but for analysis instead of execution. Whose story do we send into the arena of this channel? There is a lot to uncover here, and where we go changes how we read everything Snow does. Option 1 is President Coin. On paper, she's Snow's opposite. Grey instead of white, underground instead of penthouse, revolution instead of order. But here's the real question. Is she actually his mirror? If we track her rise from the ashes of District 13 to the execution square, we're going to cover how a resistance leader slowly adopts the same logic as the monster she replaces. Why does she see the games as a tool worth repurposing instead of abolishing? That part matters because it forces us to ask whether Panem ever escapes the cycle or just rotates who holds the whip. Option 2 is Lucy Gray, Snow's greatest what if. At face value, she's just a singer in a ruined district, a girl with a guitar and a snake. But what if the relationship between them is the fault line that cracks the future? We could trace every moment where he chooses power over promise, fear over hope, and ask, if he had followed her out of the capital's story, do the games ever become religion? Does Panem still get a monster, or does it lose one troubadour and gain a very different kind of victor? Option 3 is broader, another institution instead of a single person. Maybe this is where we talk about the peacekeepers as Snow's exported terror, the human fence between capital and district. Why do they eat better, dress whiter, and yet remain disposable? Or we could dissect another piece of the game's machinery that looks neutral at first glance, but turns out to be a weapon. You tell me which system we drag into the light. Use the comments as our reaping bowl. Tell me, Coin, Lucy Gray, or something else, with your own pitch. I'll also put up a poll so you can vote the way Panem never lets its citizens vote, for real outcomes. Which tribute do you want to see thrown into our analytical arena next? This channel is for people who look at a single rose on Snow's lapel and see a case file, who hear an anthem and listen for the threat under the melody. Every arena, every speech, every quiet train ride between districts is a clue in a bigger political puzzle. If you've stayed with Snow's story this far, you clearly care about Panem's messy morality and all the uncomfortable why questions hiding under its spectacle. So if you want to be there when the next tribute steps up, join the channel so you don't miss the next games we break apart. And as we close, hold one last image. The execution square is empty now. The crowds have gone. The cameras are off. On the trampled stone, one of Snow's perfect white roses lies crushed, petals bruised, stem snapped, slowly wilting into the dust. The scent he used to hide the poison fades into the cold air, because even the most carefully constructed monsters eventually meet a world they can't control, and when that happens, the arena remembers every footprint, but not the man who tried to own it.